Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening to guests and students from around the world. My name is Pavlina Cherneva. I'm an associate professor at Bard College and the director of the Economic Democracy Initiative at the newly founded Open Society University Network, OSUN. Welcome to the summer speaker series that is titled Democratizing Work After the Pandemic. And today I have the special honor of introducing Lisa Herzog as our guest. Lisa is an associate professor at the Faculty of Philosophy and at the Center for Philosophy, Politics, and Economics of the University of Groningen. She studied philosophy, economics, political science, and modern history at the universities of Munich and Oxford. Between 2008 and 2011, she wrote her doctoral thesis titled Inventing the Market, Smith, Hegel, and Political Theory, when she was a Rhodes Scholar at Oxford University. Since then, she has worked at the University of St. Gallen, Leuven, Frankfurt, Stanford, and the Technical University of Munich. She works at the intersection of political philosophy and economics, focusing on the history of political and economic ideas, normative questions around markets, especially financial markets, ethics and organization, and political epistemology. She also writes for a broader public and participates in public debates about the ethics of finance, social justice, and workplace democracy. In the last year, I have had the absolute pleasure of working with Lisa on the Democratizing Work initiative with a group of female scholars and now a growing global community of people who have joined our work. This course that I'm offering for the Open Society University Network, as well as the public lecture series, are part of that work and largely inspired by the manifesto that was published last year in May. Today, we are very busy at work organizing the first global forum that is to take place in October 5th to 7th this year. So please mark your calendars. And so join us then and join me in welcoming Lisa to the seminar. Welcome, Lisa.
So I'm going to talk about workplace democracy and epistemic justice today, which is just one of the many angles on workplace democracy one can take and that I got particularly interested in. And I was not initially convinced that workplace democracy is so important. I got there step by step, as it were, by looking at how workplaces these days actually function. So my starting sense of urgency that something is wrong with companies was very much coming from realizing to what extent companies can influence public discourse. You may have heard, and if you haven't heard of it, look it up, of the so-called tobacco strategy, which is the name given by historians to the way in which the tobacco industry has influenced public discourse around the harmfulness of smoking by paying scientists, by manipulating public opinion. I mean, it's pretty crude and is all very well documented. And thereby they delayed regulation of smoking for decades, really. Another way in which companies have done a lot of harm that I found fascinating is the financial crisis of 2008, where it seemed like these bankers, they were all probably a bit greedy, but not totally evil people or so. And yet what they did ended up harming millions of people around the globe. And for me, the question was, how can this happen that you have seemingly normal people, but somehow evil organizations? So the question for me became, how can we try to prevent the kinds of moral catastrophes that happen if large organizations are not kept morally on track? And by morally on track, I mean something pretty basic, like don't do massive harm, don't violate the equal respect that is owed to everyone. And from the individual question, there is the individual perspective, there's a parallel question here, which is, well, but then if you are a person, an individual acting and working in one of these big organizations, what then does it mean to be an ethical agent, to take responsibility if you're just a cog in the wheel? And through many, many steps of theoretical arguments and practical investigations, I came to the conclusion that at least part of the answer is workplace democracy. And I'll take you through one of these lines of arguments now. The longer story with all the different lines is in the book, which I've put on the slide here, Reclaiming the System, which makes a couple of arguments that all push in that direction, basically. So what I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to talk about the use of knowledge in organizations. And this may sound familiar. You may know this title of a famous paper by Friedrich August von Hayek, which is called The Use of Knowledge in Society, which was one of the key documents for free markets, for getting rid of regulation. But our economies are not just market economies, they are also organizations. And what I want to reflect on with you is, well, how does the use of knowledge happen in organizations? And then I'll talk about the kinds of failures of respect that can go hand in hand with the way in which workplaces are currently organized, and in particular take up one line of thinking that has been very powerful in philosophical debate recently, which is called epistemic injustice. And I should say epistemic sounds technical, but just means related to knowledge or related to individuals as people who know something or want to know something. So it's this old philosophical term. Epistemology is sort of thinking about knowledge in philosophy. And there has been a lot of debate recently about epistemic injustices, so injustices towards individuals as bearers of knowledge. And I'll explain that in more detail in a minute. Then I'll talk about different epistemic cultures in organizations and how that leads to arguments against hierarchies and in favor of workplace democracy. And then I'll also talk a bit about some of the potentials, not because I would say this is the one and only argument in favor of workplace democracy, but because I think it's important that when we think about workplace democracy, we also ask ourselves hard questions about, well, how realistic is this? How efficient can these kinds of organizations be? And I think the epistemic arguments here are actually a major plus, as it were, when it comes to why democratic workplaces are actually realistic and not just some philosopher's dream. And then I'll conclude. So that's the plan for today. So let me start with a story. And this is not a thought experiment or some artificial story. I did interviews with practitioners from many different kinds of workplaces about their experiences of the moral challenges of working in such a big organization. And I'll call this person Henry. And he was an engineer who worked in a technical division of a huge company. And he told me that he had one of these bosses who was a bit difficult. The boss was also an engineer, but didn't want to know all the details of what projects they were doing. It's also not quite feasible for a boss to get all the details because the boss has to supervise many people. And then if they have to hear everything, that's just information overload. But his boss was also the kind of boss who didn't appreciate honest feedback. There's the saying, the boss only gets the good news. And that was the kind of boss who always wanted to hear about successes and what's possible, but never about challenges or obstacles. And Henry told me what kind of challenges that created for him. And he became quite savvy over time to, in a way, sort of manipulate his boss in the sense that he would then present information in a certain way in order to get the kinds of decisions from his boss that he wanted, because he felt like he's not going to listen to all the arguments anyway. So I have to present 3 options and then he'll pick the middle one or something like that. He even said, I had to present the information for bosses and dummies. So really boil it down because that was the only way to get a quick decision from his boss. And this topic, that there were difficult moral questions about how you deal with knowledge, that came up not only in that interview, but in all the interviews, actually. I talked to medical people, I talked to people in public administration, and there was always this thing about who knows what do you do with some critical piece of information? What does all of that mean? And the reason why this is so important, of course, is that in organizations, the actions of many, many, many people are connected. And one of the ways in which they are connected is by passing on information, so via knowledge. But one key question is, do individuals actually know enough about what they are doing? And there are some really deep philosophical questions here. If you do some step in a complex chain of events, how much do we actually have to know to say, I know what I'm doing? I'm moving a piece of material around. Does it mean I know what I'm doing? What if some other people are then going to do something different from what I expected with that piece of material? So can I describe my own action in these chains of divided labor if I don't quite know what other people are doing? So that creates a pretty complex constellation in organizations, in workplaces, when it comes to knowledge. One implication is that there can be really dangerous knowledge gaps. Because if certain pieces of information are not passed on, that can lead to catastrophes. And I mean, there are examples that it sounds trivial if you think about it in retrospect, but it has happened in real life, where the information in a ship about whether or not they had closed all the doors where the cars would go in a ferry ship, the information was not passed on, and they actually drove out into the sea with the doors still open, and they sank. It was the information that was missing. And in many other cases where it's about technical knowledge and so on, you have these questions about, are there knowledge gaps that might lead to problematic outcomes? And in philosophy, we often have a sort of assumption that acting badly is worse than just not acting in a certain way. So actions are taken to be more important than omissions. But when you think about organizational contexts, and that's what workplaces are, then omissions can sometimes be just as important, because if you don't pass on certain information, then others might do things that lead to really bad outcomes. Another danger that this kind of constellation creates is that you might enroll individuals for ends that they did not consent to or intend when they signed up for a certain job. And the end may be quite problematic, but they didn't know that they would be involved in this. And one radical example of that kind of constellation is when you have, say, an engineer or a chemist or so who thought that they were helping produce stuff for civilian use, and then it actually goes into military use. And often employees don't have a chance to think about, well, is that what I wanted to do with my life, produce stuff for the military? It just happens because they do one step in these long chains, and they might not even know what the final destination of the product will be. So the structure of the problem, if you want like a kind of a picture for that, is that traditional workplaces have this pyramidal structure, and a lot of the relevant knowledge about what the organization does is at the bottom, because that's where the people do the actual work, and they are in touch with clients or customers or the actual production processes. But the decisions are being taken at the top. And that means that you need a process that is really like what they try to do in planned economies. Namely, you need to get all the knowledge from the bottom of the pyramid and somehow assemble it and get it up to the top. And then at the top, they take some decisions and then need to roll it out again to reach all the different levels and to get to the bottom ground where people are doing the actual work. And there can be huge frictions in that process because relevant information can get lost, as I said, but also because information gets aggregated in certain ways. And also, and that's what Henry, this engineer, told me, because people might, for good or bad reasons, use knowledge strategically. Because, for example, if you know my boss is going to fire me if I don't tell them that the project is going well, then for sheer reasons of self-protection, you might say, no, it's going well, and then hope that it will actually get better in the future. So because of the power structures in this hierarchy, people have reasons to communicate strategically. And this may not always be morally okay, but this is just what we need to expect if people are put into these kinds of contexts. So what Henry and many others experience is that their knowledge is part of these complex structures and plays a role, or sometimes doesn't play a role when it should play a role, in the decision-making in these hierarchies. And one experience that Henry and other employees told me about in these interviews is that there was something deeply disrespectful going on in the way in which his boss did not respect his own knowledge. Because this boss thought that he was in the higher position, so somehow he seemed to think that he also knew more. Was dependent on Henry and the other engineers for understanding what was actually going on in the company and how the projects were going and what research was promising and what not, and so on. So if you have these kinds of hierarchies, you put the leaders into a very curious kind of position because they have the power over the others, but they depend on them for getting the relevant knowledge. And in this case, this boss, and from what I hear, this is not too atypical, they don't show sufficient respect for the knowledge of those people who work for them. And there was also a second way in which Henry's and other employees' situation led to a lack of respect. And that was about not being given sufficient information about important decisions at company level. So sometimes you hear about these things where a big company makes some strategic decisions, like a relocation decision or so, and the employees only learn it from the newspapers or the media. And there's something deeply unsettling about this, because they are the ones whose lives are being directly touched by these decisions, and yet they are not being informed and they are not being involved in the decision making. And there's then also this impossibility of really understanding what one is doing if one doesn't know what the company is actually up to and what the company's goals are. I mean, it depends a bit. Some companies have public reporting duties, and you can read the reports and so on. But then these reports are also to some extent forms of strategic communication. And so if you are this cog in the wheel of one of these big machines, your position as someone who knows certain things, but also wants to know certain things from the company, is often being disrespected. And I here draw on a concept from Miranda Fricker, which is this concept of epistemic injustice. She's written a book in 2007, Epistemic Injustice, Power and the Ethics of Knowing, which has been very influential. And there's now a whole kind of research paradigm about epistemic injustice. And what she writes, I'll read this quote here. She says, "To be wronged in one's capacity as a knower is to be wronged in a capacity essential to human value. When one is undermined or otherwise wronged in a capacity essential to human value, one suffers an intrinsic injustice. Being insulted, undermined, or otherwise wronged in one's capacity as a giver of knowledge is something that can cut deep." And I don't know to what extent you here have had these kinds of experiences. So maybe you can connect to this or maybe not. But I would say this is really a very important observation, that if we are not taken seriously, although we know something important and people just brush over it, that is really a deep form of disrespect and injustice. And Fricker distinguishes two forms of epistemic injustice, what he calls testimonial and hermeneutical injustice. Testimonial means that you're giving testimony and you're not taken seriously. And the typical way of that is that, for example, in a sexist, male-dominated culture, if a woman says something, it's not taken seriously. But if a man says the same thing, then this is, of course, important. And she has some interesting historical examples with sexist and racist prejudices for why certain people were not taken seriously when giving testimony. The hermeneutical version is when certain groups in society lack vocabulary for expressing their experiences and therefore cannot bring their claims into public discourse. And she has a famous example there, which is that the term sexual harassment had to be invented. It is actually quite new. And before there was this term sexual harassment, women, or sometimes also men, who made this experience did not have a word for describing what they were experiencing. And that made it much harder to take any form of action against it. So, and since then, people have also suggested other versions of epistemic injustice. And there are probably also variations of these two here. I'm not going to go into the details here, but it's clear that in our social life, there are all kinds of instances where people are not taken seriously or not given equal respect or don't have the same capacities to express their concerns, which can be grasped by this overall concept of epistemic injustice. Now, when one thinks about workplaces, again, to return to the realm of work, I think one should distinguish two ways in which epistemic injustice matters here. One is that companies or other workplaces are spaces in which many sexist and racist forms of epistemic injustice can take place. But then there is also another version of the argument here, which is that companies, by their very nature, because of the hierarchical structures they have, can also be the causes of epistemic injustices, where it's the workers qua workers that are epistemically, well, wronged or being treated unjust. And one of the versions is what I just described with regard to the example of Henry, namely that there can be this lack of respect which many leaders show towards their employees. And at least, I mean, conventional notions and readings of what leadership means, there is very little about listening and getting feedback. I mean, it's in some, schools this is coming, but the notion of being a leader, taking risks, being an authority, that is not very much about respecting others as bearers of knowledge. That is just about moving forward and so on. And that is a form of disrespect that many, many employees then experience. And the second is this lack of involvement in the processes, and many of these are epistemic processes, of determining a company's, a workplace's fate. And I mean, I'm not saying that these are only epistemic injustices, but I think the epistemic dimension is really important here. So what follows from this? I think at an sort of empirical level, it matters very much what kind of epistemic culture you have in organizations. And I mean, this is not like a one-on-one, where you can certainly say, if we have this, then we're going to have this. It's more like likelihoods and certain patterns that can develop. But I think there are good reasons to think that there can be two kinds of epistemic cultures, and workplaces might go more in one or the other direction. One is that you start out with hierarchies and lack of respect, as I just described. This means that employees will then use knowledge strategically to protect themselves, or maybe also just out of spite because they feel, oh gosh, this guy is treating me so badly, so I'm not going to tell them the truth. Sort of a natural reaction of retaliation in a way. That leads to distrust because people know that they cannot expect claims to be true. That leads to a lack of feedback. That leads to various dysfunctionalities because important information doesn't reach its aim. And that leads to the hierarchies being enforced even more strictly because we say, oh, we need to control this more. We had all these things that went wrong, so more control is needed. And then you can have a kind of negative spiral where truth and respect and treating each other respectfully with regard to knowledge are going out of the window, basically. The other sort of prototype of an epistemic culture would be that you have legitimacy of the hierarchies in a company. And I've already written democratic legitimacy here because I think the best way to create legitimacy for hierarchies in workplaces is by having democratic workplaces where those who are in leadership positions are elected to take on these positions. Then you can get, hopefully, as I said, it's not like a necessary mechanism, but there's certain likelihood, open communication, trust. That opens up the possibility for honest feedback. And that makes it possible to also have to try new things, to innovate in various ways, also to try social innovations. And if that then goes well, that can also increase the legitimacy of this organization. So this would be the positive scenario. And I'm not saying that this is only ever possible if you have democratic workplaces. I think some are formally non-democratic, but still are somehow, because the leaders understand what's going on, they act in a sort of democratic way. But to really get there and to really ensure open feedback, I think democratizing workplaces is really the best strategy that we have. And I mean, exploring in more detail how these causal mechanisms work, that's something that I would love to do in future research. But I do have sort of many forms of anecdotal evidence, for example, in the German system where employee representatives are on board levels. One person who has this role told me that, yeah, it's always them who are seen as the specialists for certain parts of a company and for, what would the employees say about certain things. So this knowledge from the employee representatives really makes it to the board, and then it's taken into account in decisions. Although, as you probably know, the German system still always has one more vote for the side of capital. And so in that sense, it's not fully democratic, but it's more than you have in many conventional firms in other countries. So now you might ask, well, but if we have democratic workplaces, in order to avoid all these hierarchies that are so harmful for dealing with knowledge in organizations, can they actually deal with knowledge in a better way? Is there also kind of positive argument here, not just the critique of hierarchies, but also a positive case for democratizing work from an epistemic perspective? And I think that's an argument one can make. And I've tried to make this argument in a paper with a colleague, Felix Gerlsbeck. And what we did there was to look at theories of democracy that focus in particular on the ways in which democracies can bring together what's often called the knowledge of the many. And that is a formula that goes back to Aristotle in ancient Greece, where he already said that, there are various passages where he discusses this, but the idea is that if you have many voices coming together, many people with different perspectives, bringing in their views on a certain issue, then you can make better decisions. And today, this is called the epistemic theory of democracy, where the idea is that democracy allows the society to make better decisions than if just one individual or a small group of individuals makes decisions. Now, this is controversial. There are also people who criticize democracy on epistemic grounds, saying democracies lead to horrible decisions. I tend to think that that's not true, because there are certain indications, for example, that democracies with open media systems don't have famines. That's a very famous result. And also, if you have open feedback, then democracies can function quite well, epistemically speaking. And the question, I think, is mainly whether the specific mechanisms that democracies can use to actually gather the knowledge of the many, whether these function well or not. If you have a media system that is totally divided into two different camps that live sort of in different realities, that's not very helpful for democracy. But if you have a reasonably unified media system, for example, that makes it much easier. I'm going to talk about the mechanisms for aggregating the knowledge of the many in a minute. Now, it's very important to emphasize that this is not the only defense of workplace democracy. There are many, many reasons for why we would want workplace democracy, dignity, autonomy, you name it. But I think that this epistemic dimension is important because you often get a counter argument that says, this is not feasible. And the reason why we cannot do it is because we need hierarchies in order to make decisions. And one way in which one can counter this is to point out that having hierarchies, non-democratic hierarchies, also has huge costs in terms of efficiency. And one of the reasons for that is that there are all these losses of feedback opportunities, of honest communication, and so on, if a company or workplace is structured in hierarchical ways. So the epistemic argument here can help reject certain counter-arguments by saying, well, no, actually, there are epistemic benefits, and hierarchies can be epistemically really harmful, and that also matters for the efficiency of companies. Now, if one wants to make that kind of argument, one question that one needs to address beforehand is, what does it actually mean to have good outcomes or to make good decisions for companies? Because what you wouldn't want to get is a kind of argument where you say, oh, let's get all the knowledge from the employees just in order to increase the stock market price for a certain company. But rather, I think one needs to think about companies here in a more holistic sense, where it's about genuine win-win situations where the employees, the investors, and the wider society benefit from the activities of a company. That's sort of the target function here, not just shareholder value or something like that. But I think that this is now really a shift in the discursive landscape about companies, and more people are recognizing that just maximizing shareholder value really isn't a legitimate reason for companies to exist. And companies need to have a better, what's called license to operate in business ethics, and need to provide some genuine value and good jobs and so on. So then what are these epistemic mechanisms? I'll discuss two mechanisms and then one feature that follows from these mechanisms. The first is voting. And there are many discussions about the ways in which voting can help to aggregate opinions and thereby to get closer to what one could describe as good outcomes. You may be familiar with the Condorcet jury theorem, which is a theorem which can be formulated mathematically, which holds that if you have a group of people and on average, each of them is more likely to be right than not, so it's a sort of a right or wrong decision, then if you have a majority vote, you're more likely to get the right outcome than if just one single person decides. It's a version of the law of large numbers, that if you aggregate their votes, then you'll get a better likelihood of having the right outcome. There are some assumptions here, for example, that they all vote independently, and that, as I said, each of them needs to be between 0.5 and 1 in terms of the likelihood of getting it right. And there have been different versions of that theorem. But the basic idea is, well, if more people aggregate their views, we are more likely to get it right than if just one person makes a decision. And one particularly interesting mechanism that is particularly relevant for workplaces is that voting is usually understood as taking place anonymously in order to protect every voter to make their decision independently. And as I described earlier, one of the big challenges in companies is that you don't get feedback to the higher levels in the hierarchy because people are afraid and because bosses can fire them or punish them in other ways. If you have an anonymous voting process, then people can really vote for what they think is the right thing, if it's truly anonymous. I mean, you need to make sure that there is no way of guessing afterwards who voted in what way, of course. Well, I mean, that doesn't sound impossible. And in that sense, voting can help to get like painful messages to those in the higher ranks of a workplace that people would not feel confident to speak about if they had to speak non-anonymously. So that is one very interesting way in which getting feedback into workplaces can be facilitated by having a democratic mechanism such as voting. I think that's an interesting mechanism, and I think that is particularly interesting for sort of preventing really bad outcomes. So, for example, voting really bad bosses out of office. But I think it's not the strongest one when it comes to really taking advantage of the knowledge of the many different perspectives that you have at a workplace. The more interesting one is what philosophers call deliberation. So open discussion with no power hierarchies. Everyone can really speak, bring in their perspective, speak on eye level, as it were. And people listen to each other's arguments and react to the arguments and are also willing to change their mind. That's the ideal of deliberation that Habermas and other philosophers have put forward. And it's not always easy to realize this in practice, but it's also not impossible, especially if you have the right setting, and sometimes moderator can be very useful. Then you can have the benefits of bringing in really all these different perspectives into a discussion, and to make decisions that take all kinds of angles into account, and also think about all kinds of potential scenarios, because people know about different things. And what makes this also particularly interesting for workplaces is that in workplaces, almost by definition, you do have different competences and different roles being brought together. And so one very interesting way is, or one very interesting question is, in what way companies can facilitate genuine deliberation, where people really reflect openly and honestly with each other. And Alex Kruger is also here today. We have a project together where he interviewed people in companies that try to implement deliberative practices. And the results, it's a small sample, but the results are really positive in the sense that people do deliberate together in ways that fulfill certain criteria about genuine deliberation, and not just sham versions that are distorted by power or so. And if you have these mechanisms, it introduces one feature of democratic decision-making that is particularly interesting for workplaces, which is that you can always self-correct, and you get what philosophers, again, slightly technically call reflexivity. So you can reflect about the ways in which you make decisions and revise these as well and correct these. And you can change the goals of the company or the workplace. So it's not like you have a certain goal, like shareholder value maximization, and then you only have instrumental questions about how best to get there. What you can also do is to actually decide, well, actually, we need to change directions. We want to go into a different market or have a different product line or whatever. And that is particularly useful for companies in complex and changing environments, where you cannot just say, here's our goal and now we're going to run, but you might have to react very flexibly to new challenges and changing situations. And so that would be another benefit, where getting the voices of all employees into the decision-making process can actually protect companies for running in the wrong direction for too long, and make sure that there is feedback and you can adapt and correct. And it's sort of funny, because those are the kinds of features that entrepreneurs and innovators and so on often want to have from companies. They want them to be flexible and adapt quickly and so on, but they rarely think about democratizing decision-making as a way to get there. But if the arguments that I've now presented here are correct, then that would actually be the way to go. So in conclusion, I think there are, as I said, various justifications for workplace democracy. And the epistemic one is one. What I don't want to say is that if for whatever reason, for a specific workplace, this knowledge argument doesn't work, because, I don't know, you have such specialized experts that they can't really deliberate because they are in such a specialized niche that it's too complicated for others to follow or whatever. There might be cases where it's maybe not so likely that these epistemic benefits can materialize. That's not the end of the story. There might still be other arguments for workplace democracy, and then you'd have to think about other mechanisms for making sure that you can deal with all these different forms of knowledge. What I also think is that workplace democracy can actually take different forms, and I've distinguished between voting and deliberation. There are myriads of sub-versions of these different things, like what voting mechanisms do you actually use? How do you set up deliberation? Do you do small group or large group deliberation? Do you have the experts deliberate first and then involve others? So there are lots of design options that one has. And I think at this point, we still don't quite know what works best in what scenarios. We have maybe some ideas about, okay, here voting doesn't really make sense because it's so specialized that people don't know what it's about. So we first need to have an information campaign or something, or we rather have a small team of people as representatives who then learn about this and then they make a decision. So I think there are really lots of design options that would all count as democratic and that can help us to deal with different forms of knowledge in different kinds of constellations and workplaces. And in democratic theory, there is this term democratic experimentalism, which describes in the political sphere that we might want to have different designs like citizen assemblies or different forms of federalism and so on, to find out how our democracies can work best and to try new things, try new practices. And I think that's what we also want to have for the world of work. We don't want to have just one model that is always going to be best. We want to try out lots of different things to find the best version for different constellations. And I'll conclude with a quote. I mean, this is not totally serious, but I just like the parallel here. So there is this quote from Dewey, who actually misquoted someone else here, who said, "Invent the printing press and democracy is inevitable." And I'm fully aware that there were a couple of centuries between the printing press and widespread democracy. But the idea is that if you have the means of communication, then you cannot exclude people from joint decision-making in the long run. They will claim their right that they get involved. And maybe, and that's the hypothesis that I want to leave you with, if you want to be a bit optimistic, we can say invent the internet and democratic work is inevitable. And we'll see how many centuries it takes us. Thank you very much. And now I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you very much for a very rich and interesting presentation. There's so many themes to discuss. I want to urge our guests to use the raise hand function to ask you questions, and as well as use the chat box. I know that some of the students that are joining us are coming from places with some internet and electricity issues, so please use the chat function if you prefer. But I will open it to the floor. Nico, yes, please go ahead.
Guten Tag, and thank you so much for this great presentation.
Oh, sorry. I'm sorry, Nico, I muted you by accident.
You're muted now.
Yeah.
Can you hear me now? Okay. So you launched this idea that, you know, work democracy is not just an utopian concept and that it is actually possible. And in one of your articles, you bring up the example, the German model of co-determination. And I was wondering if there are any other successful models that, you know, maybe in Europe that work and that could serve as inspiration.
I have to apologize. My connection was bad for the first half of your question. Could you repeat that, please?
Sorry, I can repeat it. In one of your articles, you bring up the example, the German model of co-determination. And I was wondering if there are any other models like that, maybe in Europe, that we could really use as inspiration. And also I was thinking whether we should eliminate the hierarchy model, or whether in some cases it can indeed work, and whether it is necessary. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I mean, I'm not saying German co-determination is perfect, but it goes at least in the right direction. And the Scandinavian countries also have versions of that that are somewhat different, but it's often has also this dual structure of board level representation and some form of worker representation more in the operational part, so worker councils. So one first thing you could do is look at the different European versions and also the versions for different industry to see there are some differences. But the important message is that on the whole, they function quite well, and they could be developed further to be truly democratic. There's also the model of cooperatives, of course, where you have the owners and the employees as the same group, basically. And that's, in a way, the sort of ur-democratic form of organizing work. So one interesting question is, why don't we actually have more cooperatives? Why would people not want to start their own cooperative instead of working for a hierarchical company? And there's now this movement of platform cooperativism that takes the principle of cooperatives to the digital world. There's a website where they have lots of information. So that's also a very interesting model. And I think you had a lecture by Isabel Ferreras on the bicameral model, which is sort of similar to the German and other European models, but has two chambers instead of employee representation in one chamber. So there are lots of design options, but as far as I know, the bicameral model has not been realized anywhere so far. So if you're looking for real examples, then the European countries. Am I still connected?
Yes. Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Sorry, I'm not sure
Can you hear us now?
Yes, now I'm back.
We can hear you loud and clear. There was a little blip there, but we
can
hear you. Yeah.
Yeah, and then about the hierarchy model and whether I think it should completely go away. So I'm not saying that we can do completely without any forms of hierarchies. I think there is an argument to be made that we need people who can take care of conflicts, make decisions in certain situations, but it can be rotating hierarchies and it can be elected hierarchies. So it doesn't have to be just bosses that are sent from the CEO without any sort of counterpower from the employees. And I haven't encountered any argument so far about why we should have hierarchies that are not democratically controlled. Maybe there are some arguments in very specific constellations, and maybe more in kind of emergency situations where you need to have decision-making that is really just top-down, something like maybe in certain situations, if the army needs to help in a natural catastrophe, maybe, but then why couldn't they elect the leader beforehand? So far, I'm not really convinced there's any argument that would not, also be possible with elected leaders. There's one additional question that I haven't discussed here, which is how to deal with really specialized knowledge and the authority of experts. And I think that is a real challenge, both in political democracy and also in workplace democracy. On Corona, we should really listen to the virologists, and on certain technical issues, we should listen to the engineers. So how do we deal with that fact if we have more democratic structures otherwise? Because that's the one area where I would say it's not true that all voices count equally. If you really have expertise on certain areas, sometimes certain voices should count more than others. And I can't claim that I know as much as a virologist just by 10 minutes of Googling about the coronavirus. So that is a challenge both in workplace democracy and in political democracy. How do we deal with expert knowledge? But that requires different answers. And it depends very much on the constellation, I would say. There's no one-size-fits-all answer to that problem. It's not per se a justification to go back to hierarchies or to keep hierarchies in place.
Thank you, Lisa. Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Lisa. Also, Dimitar, go ahead.
My question is, are you aware of a corporate example of workplace democracy? What I mean by this is a company that maybe most of us are aware of, or we've heard it. Maybe an example, because as we read in your research, Germany was a really good example as a whole, but maybe a corporate example.
You mean you want the name of a company?
I was just wondering if a company that is more popular is already applied.
I mean, all the like Siemens or BMW or, I mean, Volkswagen is actually a difficult case for workplace Democrats, because Volkswagen it has public ownership and democratic structures, and yet it had this huge diesel scandal. So you wonder, well, maybe not all democratic companies are better than all non-democratic companies, but all the big companies from Germany that you could list, they all have the structures of co-determination. It's not quite true, because nowadays, and that's something the unions have been fighting against as much as they could, they can also opt for a certain European form of corporate law or corporate structure where there is less co-determination than in the traditional German model. So there's, at the moment, there are these tensions between the European SE and the German legal forms. And it's actually a requirement if you have more than, I think, 2,000 and then 5,000 employees, that first you have to have 1/3 employee representatives at board level, and then 49 basically. But that's actually not always realized. And also the works councils, which are the representatives of workers on the shop floor, as it were, you have the right in a German company to start these as soon as you have 5 employees. But it's the employees who have to take the initiative. And sometimes they don't in small companies because things seem to go well and they think they don't need it. Sometimes it's the bosses that very actively work against this, although that's illegal. But there has just been actually a new law to try to make it easier. But yeah, that's the rules in Germany. So in that sense, just pick whatever German company, and many of the Scandinavian countries, as I said, you could also think about these examples. They are there and they compete internationally, and according to standard economic theory, they should all be bankrupt, but they aren't.
Thank you. Okay, Max, go ahead, ask your question.
Hello, Lisa. So I remember that in your essay, you say by incorporating workspace democracy, you can allow the employees into the discussion of major programs. So like preventing companies from making big mistakes. But however, I mean, I've also read some criticisms that workplace democracy that allows employees to discuss will probably be too time consuming, and that companies lose some very valuable business opportunities, or probably couldn't react quick enough in a time of crisis. So I just want to ask, in your opinion, what's your comments on these criticisms about workplace democracy is not efficient enough in this time of crisis?
Yeah, that is a good question. And that's a reaction that one often gets. And there's a couple of answers. One is that we are not talking about direct democracy in most cases. This is with elected representatives. And I don't know why a committee with 5 managers and 5 worker representatives would be per se slower than one with 10 managers. Although you could say, well, there's more conflict, maybe, but the empirical evidence of the European companies shows that they are actually able to make decisions together quite efficiently. So that is part of the answer. And that's also why we have representative democracy in the political life. I would say that ideally you have representative and more participatory forms of democracy. But when you have a crisis situation, then you would often let the elected representatives take quick decisions. Another part of the answer is that let's assume it's true that sometimes it takes longer to make decisions if you have all these representatives of different groups together. That may cost more time, but it can have lots of disadvantages when it comes to then implementing the decisions, because the decisions have greater legitimacy. And there's less resistance, and certain objections have been incorporated beforehand because there were representatives of all groups at the table. So even if you lose certain amounts of time at the beginning arriving at a decision, that could be a very good investment if you then have a better decision that is perceived as legitimate by all sides and that gets implemented very easily. And a third answer is digital technologies. I mean, for many of these forms of decision making, you can actually use really clever digital tools to get information to many people very quickly, to use online voting, online discussions, feedback forms, and so on, that can save a lot of time and energy on the ground. If you just, and I mean, we're using these tools all the time, but we're often not putting them in the service of democratic decision-making, but for other kinds of efficiency gains. But it's very interesting. There is now this whole movement, or what do you call this management trend of agile work and holacracy and all these forms, especially in software development, where you have very participatory forms of decision making. But the companies haven't introduced this because they want to democratize firms, but because they actually want to be more efficient. And some sociologists have done studies on this, and apparently it's experienced very differently by people. Sometimes it is a real empowerment process, and sometimes people feel like they are just putting under more pressure. So it depends on how this is being implemented. And I'm not saying that the technology as such is going to solve the problem. There are still lots of questions about power, and there's a need for political struggles here. Like between the printing press and democracy, it was also not an automatism, but it enabled us. And I think we should really look at ways in which democratic decision-making and democratic practices can also be facilitated through new technologies. I mean, some people are very skeptical about the whole digital transformation, and it's really dark and negative sides for workers. But I think there are also potentials, and maybe we should think a bit more about how we could use them to help democratize firms.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Max. A reminder, please feel free to use also the chat function to ask you questions. Welcome, Ofer. Please go ahead.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. I'm actually a colleague of yours from Groningen University, Campus Friesland. Thank you so much. I loved that. Really, really interesting stuff. I especially was inspired by this, which was completely new to me, this idea that actually hierarchical structures can be corrosive for knowledge generation. That was, I never thought of that. That was very interesting for me. I have loads of questions, but I'll just ask you a couple, if I may. So the first thing, the standard economic counter argument is that capital is happy to take risk, labor is risk averse, so it's better that capital will own. And it creates a more efficient market. That's the claim. I'm not saying that I support it, but that's what I'm being told when I say things like you say. So what is a good answer to that? The second question is, we know that, and a couple of times you kind of moved from this level of the state democracy and the firm democracy. So what in your opinion are the kind of spillover effects that could happen if we democratize the firm? That how can we theorize or find practical evidence that it could spill over to democratization at the state level? And the third thing is, what kind of how can we help in research? What can, from a non-theoretical point of view, if I have, and I do have access to loads of co-ops, they want help, what would be the best thing that we can do in order to, push that agenda forward? Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll take them in reverse order. I mean, one thing, especially about co-ops, seems to me that we need to get the word out that this can work and that there is this model. I studied economics between 2002 and 2007, and it was in Germany, and there you have a combination of economics and business management. I learned nothing whatsoever about co-ops, unions, co-determination. I mean, this was in Germany. So we have the practices, but even those countries don't teach management students or economic students about these things. So I think there is really a case to be made that we need to get this paradigm that companies have to be capitalist companies, full stop. That's what needs to be attacked. And as a matter of public discourse, teaching practices. There's a lot of stuff we could say about what kind of research would be helpful. Maybe we should meet one-on-one. And this, I can only just mention once more this global forum that we're organizing, that Pavlina already mentioned in October, we really want to get together lots of different people from different fields, practitioners, researchers, to also generate ideas for research projects very concretely and so on. One thing that I would find very interesting, and I haven't seen that, maybe I've overlooked it, but there's one problem just in parentheses, is that this research is taking place in so many different fields that it can sometimes be very difficult to find things. But I haven't so far seen any detailed qualitative studies about the epistemic side of decision-making processes in cooperatives, maybe in a comparative perspective to a similarly shaped non-cooperative. Is it really true what I've hypothesized, that people speak out more freely and feedback works better and so on? So having some qualitative case studies there, that would be fascinating. And maybe we can talk more about this. Then the state firm spillover effect. So the basic idea, just for everyone, is that if you have democratic workplaces, people will also be better democratic citizens because they learn at work how to participate in democracy and how to find compromises, discuss, and so on. There were a couple of studies that tried to find this based on cooperatives, or I think it was mostly cooperatives, some with co-determined firms. And the evidence was sort of inconclusive, but it was also methodologically a bit poor in the sense that these were fully capitalist countries, and then a few cooperatives, and people were, for example, asking, are these people who work in cooperatives more active in civil society? And you could say, well, if it's only a few, maybe there are other effects. So it was questionable. One study that came out recently that I found very interesting, though it's only in the German context, and it's also not looking in sort of the nitty-gritty details, but that there's a thing called the German Authoritarianism study, which is done every few years, which looks at authoritarian and democratic attitudes among Germans. And they introduced an item in the last version, which they called industrial citizenship, I think. And they had 4 questionnaire items, like, can I make a difference at my workplace? Can I speak openly about unions? Can I solve problems together with my colleagues? And a 4th one. But basically, do people have agency at work? And in this big data set, there were strong correlations between high values of industrial citizenship and high pro-democratic attitudes and anti-authoritarian attitudes. And I mean, of course, this would have to be repeated in other countries and so on, but I found this really interesting, that if you do that kind of population-wide study, you do find these correlations. And then about the capital and labor and risk-taking issue. One very simple point is workers also carry risks, and especially in contrast to liberal market economies, they often have very specialized knowledge that they can only use productively in certain companies, and they have a life around their jobs. They live in a certain place, so it costs them if they lose their job. And so a first thing to say is it's simply not true that capitalists carry all the risks and workers don't. And capitalists, in a way, they can just sell their shares. That's a much easier way of exiting than changing jobs. Another thing is that, I mean, at least in certain models of workplace democracy, the idea is not that those who invest their capital would have no say whatsoever. So it depends on the model. In bicameralism, you'd have one chamber of the shareholders, and some would say, well, that's still a lot too much voice for them. But I would say, look, if you have really capital intense industries, maybe in those you need to, and maybe high risk industries, maybe in these capital owners need to be given a bit more say than in other industries. And one interesting thing is that lots of new businesses are actually not capital intense. Like all the online businesses, they hardly need any starting capital. They have some employees, a bit of technology, but it's not like you need to build railways or something like that. And so there is a real question about the weight of capital in future companies. And one indication of that, so I read a paper the other day about the relation between companies that are highly valued on stock markets and those that contribute a lot to GDP in terms of job creation. And in the past, so 50s to 70s roughly, this was sort of aligned, but it has gone apart. And the main explanation these authors give is that it's precisely because the new companies, the tech companies, don't need a lot of capital. And so our whole way of thinking about risk distribution and the role of capital and so on might really have to change quite massively given new technologies and new business forms. So it's not my field of expertise. Maybe Pavlina could actually say more about this. But I think the picture where one side has all the risk and the other side has no risk, that's just completely bogus. And we might need to give them some voice in some circumstances. And then last word on this, in a more just society, capital would also be less concentrated, and then things would again probably look quite differently. That's yeah.
Wonderful. Thank you, Lisa. We have, as I've mentioned in other seminars, but I didn't mention here, we have people from virtually every continent except for Antarctica, I think, with us at these seminars. And we have a question from a student from Myanmar. Thank you for your valuable sharing. As the epistemic benefits of democracy apply to decision-making within the companies, what is your opinion or suggestion for the uncertain and changeable context in which companies operate? For example, companies in Myanmar, where there's an emergency situation under a military coup.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, my sympathies to people there. I don't know whether the kind of uncertainty here is fundamentally or sort of different in nature from other sorts of uncertainty from the epistemic side. Of course, it's different in many other respects. But when it comes to how a company can navigate this landscape and try to find its way, I will still think that reflecting together and taking on different perspectives from all members of a company is more promising than just one person making decisions. But there is probably, and I don't know much about the situation in Myanmar, I just know about it from newspapers. What might make the situation really complicated is if you have a political division among the employees, and some are for the new regime and some are against it, and what that introduces to the discussions in a company. And whether there's also maybe, I don't know, fear of some people spying on others. That's something I don't know about, but that of course would make deliberation of any type, also in civil society, potentially very different and difficult and dangerous for people. So that's something, I guess, where one cannot say anything in general, but needs to make very context-specific judgments about what is feasible and what is not feasible. But I think the general principle that people thinking about decisions together being better than just one person taking decisions on their own, that I would think still holds in very difficult political situations as well.
Thank you. I have a question of my own that is slightly changing direction a little bit. I wonder if you have thought about your own work in relation to the work on, for example, by Graeber on bullshit jobs. The question of epistemic justice or injustice, how that relates not just to how one understands their own place in the workplace and whether they are valued as a person, but how they themselves value the experience that they have in the workplace. And I want to say that I've just read a very, I have not finished reading the paper, a very interesting paper by Cambridge sociologists who are actually making the argument that a very small proportion of people actually think their jobs are bullshit jobs, but it is a certain sense of alienation that is giving this overall discontent that Graeber rightly recognizes in his work. How do you connect your own work to these themes?
Yeah, thank you. Maybe you can send me the paper. That sounds very interesting. I think, one way to think about this is that people talk about their work to different people. And the the sort of self-dialogue is in a way just the extreme case, but it's also a dialogue with friends and family outside the company. And what's so particularly painful about the bullshit jobs is that in a way, because you want to retain the social recognition for your job, deep down you know that it doesn't create any value. I mean, assuming it's a real bullshit job, let's just postulate that it's really the case. You know deep down that it doesn't add any value, but you might not want to speak out about this because you still want to get the recognition for having a proper job or something. And that in a way forces you to lie or to color things in a certain way. And I think any social practice that forces people to lie and to be dishonest is ceteris paribus problematic. And we should think about, okay, what if anything can justify that? I mean, the broader perspective here is probably something like this. And I'm sort of improvising now, so I hope I can express my thoughts clearly. One of the key reasons for why bullshit job exists, according to Kraber, is that people have such unequal purchasing power. And there's these people in finance and so on that just can afford to pay lots of other people without needing them to do actual tasks, but just to show off and to win in this rat race. Oh, I'm the manager with more staff members. And that means that the existence of jobs is determined by market forces, by purchasing power, and not by any form of dialogical justification where you explain why you need that. I mean, there will be some kind of justification, but it will be bogus. And so in a way, it's very much the fact that the existence of these jobs is determined by the very unequal bargaining relations in markets, and not by something like deliberation that creates bullshit jobs in the first place. I have a hard time imagining that in a cooperative you would have bullshit jobs, because people would recognize this, they would speak out about it. It would just be wasteful for a cooperative to create bullshit jobs. And I mean, I don't know. I mean, there are probably also ways in which this could happen, but it seems much less likely to me than in a context where it's very much about money and maybe also certain forms of status and power that determine which jobs get created. So making the whole world of work more deliberative and less determined by purchasing power might itself be one form of fighting against the existence of bullshit jobs.
Thank you. I will send forward the paper. Any other questions? Any other questions from our guests or our students? I will take one from the chat and then Hosanna and Nico again. How do I avoid hierarchy in the workplace? I think we talked a little bit about, the different types of hierarchy, but
I guess the answer must differ depending on what kind of hierarchy we are talking about. And I focused mostly on formal hierarchies in the sense of non-democratic forms of power that someone at a certain level in a company has over others. And we avoid, or I mean, it's not in a way avoiding them, but we completely change their nature by democratizing them and by having people vote for who gets to be their boss, or having them agree that they will rotate and taking on different roles for different projects maybe. So that would be a way of getting rid of formal hierarchies, although they would still be different positions, but they would have a completely different nature, and they would be determined in a way in a purely functional sense, just because someone needs to make a decision at some point, or because someone needs to settle a conflict, and not because someone is per se always more powerful than others. But there is also, of course, another question here about sort of informal hierarchies that can come up in workplaces, that can arise because someone is, I don't know, particularly charismatic or a good speaker, or in a culture where you have all kinds of other hierarchies. There might be differences between men and women, and men are seen as higher up in the hierarchy than women also. And there it takes active work to combat these hierarchies. And I'll give you a concrete example. So in hospitals, there is always, or very often, a perceived hierarchy and a felt hierarchy between doctors and nurses. And that, I mean, this has to do with lots of cultural reasons for that. I mean, doctors usually go to universities and nurses might not. And so this is seen as higher educated. And also traditionally, the doctors were mostly male and the nurses female, and all kinds of reasons for why these perceived hierarchies are there. And many companies have actually realized that this is really problematic because the nurses often have important knowledge, or they see certain things that the doctors need to know. And so some companies have, some hospitals have active programs for trying to fight against that informal hierarchy. And it's not enough that the doctor just says, oh, please give me all the feedback you want. It really has to do with certain patterns of behavior, self-perception of everyone involved, and practices of communication. And if you have a situation where you start from such a situation of hierarchy, it can take quite some work to get to communication on an equal footing. And this is something that it takes a certain investment to, and it may never go completely away, and you may have to have constant reminders that you don't fall back into these old patterns. But I would also say that the greatest likelihood that this kind of process can be successful is if the formal hierarchies are being democratized, because then people also have the sort of aligned incentives to also get a more democratic culture, and it's more likely that they will care about this.
Yeah, this is great. I think a maybe more extreme example of how this hierarchy could be harmful are the protocols of how airline pilots communicate with each other. That old cultural norms of when to speak up, when you are the captain versus the assistant pilot, have resulted in accidents. And that process has launched a new protocol and expectation of how information is shared among these parties. So it really can be.
I think the ones in hospitals are actually taking some cues from the ones in airlines. Actually, they try to follow some of the tricks that they had developed at airlines. Yeah.
Very interesting. Okay, Hosanna, please.
And thank you so much, Professor, for the amazing lecture. I would like to ask about in industrialized countries, how we can provide like new jobs in order to decrease an unemployment rate. Because in industrialized countries, we use different technology if we compare to agricultural countries. So how we can make this or how we can use these kinds of technologies as we have in terms of industrialized tools in a society in order to decrease rate of unemployment. Because as I think, in any country, if it's industrialized, we need to have very high or super skilled laborers in order to run the economy. So how we can decrease the rate of unemployment in this case?
Well, I don't know whether Pavlina has already lectured on the job guarantee idea, or whether this is still going to come. But that is one proposal. And one of the reasons for why I find it so attractive is that if you take a sort of very naive, commonsensical look at society and, where do we have a need for more hands, more people doing things? There are so many areas where we do need work, but they are not the ones where companies can expect to make a lot of profit. And so a public job guarantee can potentially fill that gap between what societies need and what kinds of jobs are being offered. And just as one sort of indication for this difference between what labor markets provide and what societies need, in many European countries, I don't know about the US, but in Europe during the first lockdowns, there was this talk about essential jobs or systemically relevant jobs. You probably had something like that in the US as well. The jobs that we really need to keep our societies going. And many of those are quite lowly paid. Many of them are in the public sector. And if you think about, okay, what kind of tasks do we really need in our societies? You get a completely different perspective from what kinds of jobs are being offered by companies. Another part of an answer, I think, can also be to think really radically about the ways in which subsidies and taxation favor certain companies over others, because even private companies, I mean, they calculate, okay, where do we want to create jobs and where not? And the way in which, for example, currently oil and gas companies still receive massive subsidies, even though the number of jobs they have is sort of limited. So if you subsidize green energy, for example, that could be a major way of creating more jobs. It would be, probably some of them would be in the public sector, some in the private sector, but it depends on how the framework for markets is being set through all these regulations, subsidies, taxes, and so on. It's not like this is all a natural process and we just have to watch and cannot do anything. Those are political decisions about which industries to support, which ones to regulate more strongly, and so on. And that has a major impact on job creation. And last point, and I think that's more an issue in Europe than in the US, there's also the question of how you tax labor and how you tax capital. Because again, companies are going to make a decision, you know, if you have very high taxes on labor, ceteris paribus, they will create fewer jobs. So if you tax capital more highly instead, that might also lead to more job creation. So I think there are many, many different ways, and it depends very much on the concrete situation of a country, which of these are most promising. So I don't have a answer that would fit in the same way for all countries. But both in the private and in the public sector, the number of jobs is something that can really be influenced by lots of different measures. And Pavlina, maybe you want to add something? I don't know.
No, I think you're absolutely correct. That's the framework of thinking about it, that we have so very narrowly focused only on market mechanisms for job creation, where moments of crisis reveal a very fundamental truth, that we work to provision for ourselves in multiple ways, and many of those ways don't have commercial return. Many of those ways are just part of the human condition, and that needs to guide policy in terms of, you know, what we do, how we do it, and we also, and what we value. I think, like, how the market also structures our values, and they are exemplified by certain prices and wages, but we understand that those on whom we vitally depend or on cannot themselves provide for themselves, right? Support themselves and their own families. So there is a skewed structure, not just in job creation, but in how we value work. So yeah, we did talk about the job guarantee a little bit earlier. And we will have more opportunities to talk about public policy in general, right? And how that is situated within a broader policy framework for economic stability. Nico, you had one more question, and then we'll take Momo's question as the final for the day.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, so I wanted to address the challenge of corporations to collect aggregate information, especially because we know that when we read data that goes along with our original opinions, we're more likely to agree with it. And I know you brought up voting as one of the tools that we can use, but I think this is incredibly difficult because people in the upper management aren't always gonna have a high sense of, morality, or aren't gonna be willing to lose their power. And I obviously, I don't think you can change people's sense of what's the right thing to do. So the change has to come from the system. And I know you said the German system and the Scandinavian system isn't perfect, but it's still more democratic. And that kind of goes with the question from the chat, how can we change the system so that we move into that direction?
Yeah, thank you. I agree that it won't come just because they decide one day that they now want to be nice and want to have democratic voting and everything. I think it takes political action, but the question then is what leads to political action? And there, I think there are a couple of things that matter. One is that one can argue that this is a realistic proposal that is not completely leading to catastrophe. And that's why I think pointing to the European countries that already have certain forms of codetermination is particularly important in the context of the countries that don't have any of it, to say, look, these countries are doing it, and it hasn't led to bankruptcy or anything, and or mass unemployment or what have you, to show that those are realistic proposals, and then to at least get the discussion going. The broader thing is that I guess a lot of it has to do with the general view of how our economic systems function. And I know neoliberalism is a very broad and vague and often abused term, but I'll just use it as a catch-all phrase now. We need a new paradigm for thinking about the economy and for understanding that work is meant to serve a social purpose in the end, and that maybe there's a certain role for markets, but in the end we need much more political action to shape these markets and to also have direct public investments in many areas and public jobs. And I think that kind of paradigm change, which would then also lead to voters adopting different positions and parties including different proposals in their platforms and so on, that takes time and effort. And the thing that makes me optimistic that this is not impossible is that it also took the neoliberals quite a few decades to get through with their message. So I think we should really think in the long term here, even though it would be nice to have immediate successes, but it will take a while. But if the general paradigm of what our economic systems are for changes, then I think political action can actually happen quite quickly. And that's what's needed. And one last thing that can also help is if you have some companies that are willing to try these things and to say, okay, let's see what happens. And in countries where this does not exist, that can be extremely valuable to change the perception of what's possible. Because a lot of public discourse in a way is not even about what's good or bad, it's about what's possible and what do people think about, what's sort of the range of options that people have in mind when thinking about economic policy. And it's on that fundamental level that a lot of work needs to be done to convince voters that the arguments that it's all about markets and they're going to take care of everything, that's just bullshit. And we need a different way of thinking about this. And that's why raising awareness is hugely important. But if you want something to do in the short term, I think supporting unions and becoming a member, working with them and so on, that's also a really important part of the strategy, because they are aware of all these challenges and they often have good people on the ground and they can help to guide concrete political action in concrete places. So I think working with unions is also a very important sort of short-term strategy that all of us can adopt.
All right, we are at the top of the hour. I want to